Hey y'all, it's movie night. But before we go any further, I need 3 minutes from you. Just three. Because before we step into this desert, something needs to be said clearly. George Miller made Mad Max in 1979. No studio safety net, about $400,000. And one question he couldn't shake. What are human beings, really, when you strip away everything we use to hide it? Not what shows up after the collapse. What if it was already here, dressed correctly, positioned correctly, speaking the right language in the right rooms to the right people who decide who gets to listen? 5 films, 45 years, same desert. And every time it comes back to this. Someone has the resource, someone else needs it. And everything that has ever happened to human beings happens in the space between. War, empire, law, narrative, religion. Every story ever told to explain why the people at the bottom belong at the bottom. All of it in that space. Today I'm not explaining the films. You have eyes. I'm just showing you the reflection. This isn't science fiction. Science fiction imagines worlds that don't exist yet. This is recognition. The desert isn't where we're going. It's where we are. Furniture removed. So watch. We listen. We witness. And when it's over, you won't unsee it. Not a threat. A receipt. Start with Furiosa. Picture a green place. Clean water, living things, a community of women who built something quietly. Without conquest, without an army, without a flag or a doctrine justifying the taking of anything that wasn't theirs. Something genuinely worth having. And a man comes in a white robe, moving through the wasteland like someone who was sent, like someone carrying answers the desperate people around him had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. His name is Dementus, and I need you to see past the character, because what George Miller put on that screen is not an invention. It is a type, recurring, documented, historically consistent across every culture and every century and every configuration of human desperation that has ever existed anywhere on this earth. The charismatic man with no capacity to build anything, who substitutes performance for substance, who wraps himself in the aesthetics of the sacred, the white, the flowing garments, the language of destiny and protection and chosenness, to fill the space where actual leadership would otherwise have to exist. Who collects the desperate, the displaced, the people who have lost enough that the bar for what they will accept has dropped below anything they would have considered possible before loss found them. Who calls himself a father figure to children he separated from their actual families. We have always had names for that type: cult leader, demagogue, grifter dressed in a sacred clothing. And every version of that type across all of recorded human history shares one defining characteristic. They do not build. They extract. They arrive somewhere something exists, dismantle it in the process of claiming it, call the wreckage someone else's inheritance, and move to the next place before the accounting comes due. I'm not going to name names. I don't need to, because right now, while I'm talking, a face appeared in your mind, and you recognized it. That recognition, that specific, immediate, involuntary recognition, is the entire point of today. Dementus is not something George Miller invented in a writing room. Dementus is a pattern George Miller recognized in the world and rendered visible by removing everything around it except the sand. Now watch what happens to the child he takes. She doesn't become a hero because someone saves her. She becomes a weapon first, aimed by the system that stole her at the targets the system needs eliminated. And then slowly, painfully, over years of being used by one power structure and then another, she learns the machine from the inside, with a specific unsentimentalized understanding that only comes from having been used by something long enough to see every gear. Hold that. We're going to need it at the end of this. Now picture this, 1979. George Miller is living in a world that just came through Vietnam, through Watergate, through an oil crisis that showed ordinary people, for the first time in the post-war era of institutional faith, that the supply of normal life could be interrupted by decisions made in rooms they would never be invited into for reasons that had nothing to do with their lives and everything to do with leverage. His generation watched the institutions they were raised to trust, the government, the military, the press, the law, reveal themselves under pressure to be something other than what was advertised. Not all at once, gradually, the way rot works, from the inside out, so that by the time it's visible from the outside, the structural damage is already done. And what did Miller make from this inside moment? A film about a good man. Not a corrupt man working a broken system. A good man who believed in what he was doing, who wore the uniform because it meant something to him, not as performance, as covenant, who had a family, who had a reason, who was doing the work the way the work was supposed to be done. And what that film shows you, without a speech, without anyone stopping the action to explain what it means, is the precise mechanism by which a functioning society loses itself. It is not a bomb. It is not a revolution. It is not one catastrophic visible event you can point to afterward and say, there, that's the moment. It's the slow normalization of the thing you said you would never accept. The bureaucracy stops backing its own people. The paperwork becomes more important than the outcome. The predators get faster and more coordinated while the institutions get slower and more compromised. And the people inside those institutions who still have ethical lines they haven't crossed face a choice. Leave, comply, or stay, and become something they no longer recognize when they are alone with themselves at the end of the day. The good man leaves, and what fills that space? You already know. You have watched it fill that space in real time. On your phone before you get out of the bed in the morning. In the news cycle that has normalized week by week things that 12 months ago would have been disqualifying. The institutions don't disappear when the people with ethics walk out. They just get run by whoever was willing to stay. And whoever was willing to stay for a reason. Now the transition is over. What was fragile broke, what was breaking fell, and what remains are communities, small, scattered, trying to hold on to whatever they managed to carry out of the collapse. In this case, the resource is oil. But hear me when I say, it does not matter what the resource is. The resource is always a stand-in for the same thing, capacity. The capacity to move, to build, to sustain life, to have options, to be able to say no. Whoever controls your capacity controls you. Not always with a gun, sometimes with a pipeline, sometimes with a permit, sometimes with an interest rate set in a room you will never see by people whose names you will never know, whose decision will determine whether the thing you are trying to build gets built or doesn't. Now I need to step out of this desert for a moment. Flint, Michigan had water, clean water, public water, water that the people of that city paid taxes into a system to maintain. A calculation was made. Not by the people of Flint, not in any room of the people of Flint were in or invited into, that the cost of maintaining that infrastructure was higher than acceptable given what else the money could do. So they changed the source. And when the pipes started delivering poison instead of water, started delivering lead directly into the bodies and developing minds of children, the institutional response was not repair, it was denial. Followed by delay, followed by a press strategy, followed by the kind of slow, carefully qualified liability managed acknowledgement specifically engineered to arrive after the window for real accountability had quietly closed. That is not a plot point from the desert. That is a federal investigation. That is a city. That is children. That is right now. And right now, people in places like the Antelope Valley, people trying to build something real on land they actually own, face permitting walls, code enforcement patterns, infrastructure denials that do not apply with the same consistency in other zip codes. Not because what they are building is dangerous. Because unincorporated self-sufficiency, community-sustaining independence is a structural threat to an extraction model that requires dependency to function. You cannot extract from people who don't need you. So before the guns, before anything visible enough to generate a headline, the first order of business is always make sure they need you. Keep the pipes under your control. Keep the permits in your office. Keep the options narrow enough that the choice to stay inside the system feels like the only rational one. That is not Road Warrior. That is Tuesday. Now the methodology evolves. What came before was obvious. You could see it from the horizon, raw, physical, undisguised. What comes next is more sophisticated. She doesn't need an army in that way. She has something more durable than any army ever assembled. She has a crowd. And she has studied human nature with enough cold clarity to know exactly what a crowd is for. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Say it for yourself. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Feel the rhythm of it. Feel how naturally it moves. Feel how immediately it makes you want to pick up side. That is not an accident. That phrase, that specific, simple, perfectly binary, side-selecting phrase is a policy decision dressed in the clothing of a sporting event. She built Bartertown from nothing, through will and ruthlessness and clarity about human nature that most people find deeply uncomfortable to look at directly. Bartertown runs on methane produced by pigs. The man who controls the pigs controls the power, and she, who built everything around that power, cannot allow a dependency that hands someone else leverage over what she has built. So she doesn't arrest him. She doesn't execute him. She doesn't have a public confrontation that forces people to take sides on a question of accountability. She puts his opponent in the arena, and she sells the experience. And here's what I need you to understand about the crowd in that arena. They are not passive. They are not bystanders. They are not victims of a spectacle that happened to them. They are the mechanism. Their excitement is the enforcement. Their investment in who is winning and who is losing is what makes the outcome legitimate. Because if she simply eliminated the person she needed eliminated, questions might be asked. Resistance might organize. But if the crowd demanded it, if the crowd witnessed it, if the crowd went home that night carrying the specific electricity of having been present at something decisive, then the crowd is not a witness to the exercise of power. The crowd is the exercise of power. They just experience it as entertainment. And they don't know what they are because they are entirely focused on the fight. Now I want you to think about the last electoral cycle you lived through. The debate formats, the sound bites engineered for maximum emotional velocity. The news coverage that gave you the blow-by-blow of who landed the punch, who looked tired under the lights, who had the crowd, while in the background legislation was being written. Appointments were being confirmed. Contracts were being awarded. Regulatory structures were being quietly dismantled or rebuilt depending on who needed what moved in what direction. I want you to think about the flags, the merch, the chanting, the feeling of being on the right side of something that matters. And I want you to ask yourself one question. Who built the arena? Not who is fighting in it. Not who is winning on points tonight. Not whose crowd is louder. Who built the arena? Because the person who built the arena set the rules, decided who enters, profits regardless of who wins, and is somewhere else entirely, making decisions that will shape your life in ways you won't feel fully for years, while you're focused on the fight. Who runs Bartertown? That is not a line from a film. That is the only question in any system, in any era, in any configuration of power that has ever existed. Stop watching the fight. Find out who built the arena. Now what's on the screen now looks like chaos. Fire and chrome and a wall of speakers on wheels with a man playing a flamethrower guitar at full speed across an open desert. And it is all of that, every frame of it. But underneath the velocity, underneath the fire and the chrome and the extraordinary spectacle of it, George Miller built the most precise argument about what liberation actually requires that popular cinema has produced in my lifetime. This is not a chase film. This is a logistics problem. And the solution to the logistics problem is why we are here tonight. Don't watch the action. Watch the method. Watch what she understands that no one else in the desert understands. Watch how she moves inside the machine that built her and turned it. That understanding is the whole lesson. That is what 45 years of sand was always building toward. She didn't blow it up. Take a breath. Sit with that. Furiosa had every reason, every moral justification, every legitimate human right to burn the citadel to the ground and walk away from the ash. Stolen childhood, stolen body, stolen years, stolen purpose. Because even the mission she was eventually given, even the thing that looked from the outside like agency, was still just another form of being aimed by a system she was inside of at targets the system had already chosen. She had the skills. She had the allies. She had the moment. She could have burned it. She didn't. Because she understood something that rage does not teach you, but pattern recognition eventually does. If you survive long enough, if you can hold your grief and your fury and your entire legitimate need for justice and still see clearly. The Citadel was not the problem. The Citadel was infrastructure, pipes, pumps, and aquifer. The physical mechanism for moving water from where it existed naturally to where human beings needed it to live. Neutral. Immortan Joe did not build the water. He built the story around the water, the religion, the hierarchy, the elaborate visual mythology of a man so consecrated by power that the resource itself became an extension of his divine authority. He built the story, and then he used the story to make the rationing of water feel like an act of grace rather than an act of control. He gave water to people dying of thirst and made them grateful, not to the aquifer, not to the pipes, not to whatever civilization built the infrastructure he inherited and claimed as his own creation. Grateful to him personally, specifically, religiously. And they were so grateful, so genuinely, completely, physiologically grateful that they would die for him, gladly, calling it glory, calling it Valhalla, calling it the highest honor available to a human life in the world as they understood it. Remove the myth. The water is still there. The pipes are still there. The pumps are still there. The aquifer does not require his permission to exist. It never did. And when she opens the flow and lets the water fall, unrestricted, unrationed, not a gift from a consecrated man, but a resource returning to the people it was always meant to sustain, that is not a movie ending. That is a blueprint. 5 films, 45 years, same desert. Let me tell you what George Miller was showing us the whole time. First, power concentrates around resources, always, without exception, without a single historical counterexample across the entire documented record of human civilization. The resource changes: oil, water, methane, breeding capacity, data, bandwidth, the supply chain. Your medication moves through the algorithm that decides which voices get amplified, which ones get quietly, efficiently, deniably buried. The dynamic does not change. Find the resource. Find who controls it. Find the story they built to justify the control. That is the complete map of any system you are trying to understand. Second, mythology is not decoration. Mythology is management. Every power structure in this desert wrapped itself in the sacred, Valhalla, the white robes of a self-appointed messiah, the ritual of the arena, the skeleton mask and white powder of a man who made himself a god because a god cannot be audited. Because naked power requires constant enforcement, and enforcement is expensive and exhausting and generates resistance. But power wrapped in belief, power that makes people feel chosen for accepting the terms of their own subjugation, that power maintains itself. The believer does the work. The system just has to keep the story coherent. Look at the stories being told around the resources you depend on. Look at who benefits from your belief in them. Third, the cost of the spectacle is always paid by someone who was never offered a seat. While the crowd chants, someone is deciding what they will eat. While the war boy died gloriously for the Immortan in his tower, watching the water level. The entertainment is always funded by the suffering, whoever doesn't have access to the arena. Find who doesn't have a seat. That is where the actual story is, every time. Fourth, liberation is not destruction. It is redirection. Furiosa did not have more firepower than Immortan Joe. She had more understanding of how the machine actually worked. She knew the pipes. She knew the route. She knew which war boy was capable of doubt. And she knew the precise moment when the gap between the mythology they had been given and the reality of living inside it would open wide enough that even the most devoted believer would have to look at it. And when that gap opened, she moved. Not with rage, with precision. That is the skill. That is what 45 years of sand was always building toward. Not the flame, the understanding, not the destruction, the redirection. And fifth, The thing underneath all four of the things I just told you. The wasteland is not a warning about where we are going. It is a diagnosis of where we already are with the comfortable parts removed. Every system you move through daily, financial, political, medical, legal, media, educational, carceral, municipal, every single one of them has a citadel, has a resource being controlled by someone who built a story about what that control is natural, why it is necessary, and why it is, if you look at it from exactly the right angle, sacred. And most people never question it because the story is very good. And the story started before they were born. And questioning the story has costs, social costs, professional costs, sometimes physical costs, because it was designed to have costs. The costs are part of the story. The costs are what make the story self-maintaining. George Miller spent 45 years asking one question in the desert. What are human beings actually capable of? And what are we capable of telling ourselves about it? Here with me today, you have been sitting inside the answer. Now you have to decide what you do with it. Furiosa went back. She didn't find a safer place and rebuild behind new walls and hope that she had survived, would stay far enough behind her to let her live in peace. She went back to the exact place that had taken everything from her, because that was where the water was. And the water was never Immortan Joe's to keep. It never belonged to the man in the white cape. It never belonged to whoever designed the arena and sold the experience of the fight. It never belonged to the mask or the mythology or the elaborate, generations deep, self-reinforcing story built specifically to make the people at the bottom feel like the bottom was where they naturally, inevitably, perhaps even divinely belonged. The water belongs to the people dying of thirst. It always did. From the very beginning. Before the first story was ever told about why it didn't. They just needed someone who understood the pipes, who had survived long enough inside the machine to see every gear, who could hold their grief and their fury and still see clearly, and walk back in and turn them. What you've been watching today, you are witnessing. That is where it starts. That is where it has always started. Not with fire, not with clarity. Go home. Look at your world. Find the pipes. Just witness. This is Keith. Hopefully you enjoyed the movie night with me. Just take time and think about where you're at. Where we're at. Watch the pattern and use your voice. This has been Keith Speaks.